What's up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danelle Hallan, and I am back with another true crime video. And unfortunately, I'm sure you can hear it, but I am sick yet again. My immune system seems to have just totally absconded. So at this point, I am so used to it that I am just rolling through the punches, and we are going to dive right into this video. So today we're speaking about a case that you guys are probably very familiar with. This case has been covered so many different times. There's documentaries on it, there's podcasts on it, multiple YouTube videos on it. Everyone seems to know about this case, and it's because it is so bizarre. The circumstances are just absolutely baffling. Family's life leading up to the disappearance, like every detail seems so incredibly strange, and nobody can make sense of any of it. And when you have this sort of situation, especially when just events in general are bizarre, and then you add something like this paranormal element to it, which is kind of included in this particular case, people run absolutely wild with it. It reminds me a lot of Elisa Lam, not the circumstances, but the same kind of idea. People really latch on to that. It creates all these different theories. It kind of turns into this sensationalized ghost story. I want to get the story out to you guys to get your opinions on it, see what you think, because it has been years at this point and there still seems to be absolutely no answers. Like, we are no steps closer to finding out what on earth happened to the Jamisons. So let's get into all of the nitty-gritty details. So 40-year-old Sherilyn and 44-year-old Bobby Jamison met in the summer of 2002. Sherilyn had already been married to someone else at this point. She had a son with someone else. And unfortunately, this also led to a divorce and a big move for her to Oklahoma, which is where this family was from. So Sherilyn had already been through quite a lot of challenges in life, and meeting Bobby was like this big breath of fresh air to her. According to those that knew the couple, they fell in love hard and fast. They were infatuated with each other. After a year of being madly in love, they gave birth to their beautiful little daughter, Madison. She was the center of the Jamisons' world. There are some home videos that were shown in the Disappeared documentary done on the Jamisons back in 2010 that gave an insight into the family dynamics and the love that they had for each other. They were a happy and thriving family, but an accident in 2003 flipped their worlds upside down, and it seems that from that point on, everything in their lives had changed. So in November of 2003, just as they are kind of starting their life together, they just had Madison a few months prior, Bobby ended up getting into a very serious car accident. He had been coming around a bend and he was hit by, I believe, not just one, but two oncoming vehicles. And this accident severely injured his back. And this was not something that he was simply going to snap back from. Fortunately, months passed and Bobby ended up being in chronic pain due to his back injury, and he was heavily relying on medication to even help him accomplish simple tasks around the house on a daily basis. Because of this, he was forced to give up his career. He had to go on to disability because of the amount of pain that he was in. I can only imagine how scary of a situation that must have been. First of all, even hoping that Bobby was going to be okay after this accident with a newborn baby, and then on top of that, he ends up not being able to work anymore. That puts a lot of stress when it comes to income, making sure they can take care of Madison. That is a lot to go through, but the Jamisons were determined as ever to push forward with their lives. So in July of 2004, they decided to make the trip to Arizona and the couple got married. From there, they settled into a lakeside home in Eufaula, Oklahoma, and continued raising their daughter and building their dream life. But the following years seemed to just bring on more challenges. It honestly feels like this family never got a break at all. Sherilyn had struggled for years at this point with bipolar disorder, and according to her family, she was known to go on and off her medication, which is not something at all that is uncommon. Unfortunately, a lot of the different medications that are used for things like bipolar disorder can have really unsavory side effects, and when you feel better, you get this feeling that, okay, well, I don't need to take this medication anymore. I'm fine now. I don't need these bad side effects. I don't need this, that, and the other. And this is the kind of cycle that Sherilyn seemed to be caught in. She would feel better, get off of her medication, and her life would unfortunately just turn into shambles according to everyone around her. Her family stated that when she would go off of her medication, Sherilyn seemed like an entirely different person. They have described her as becoming very hateful, very angry. It was really a challenge for everyone involved when Sherilyn would stop taking her medication and when it would get to this point. Sherilyn was also unable to work on top of all of this and was relying on disability as well. So you've got two very fixed incomes. You've got a new baby. You have struggles with mental health, and you can see how that can make their life incredibly complicated and incredibly tense at times. And unfortunately, this family was just still taking blow after blow. In 2007, something happened that sent Sherilyn to one of her lowest points, hands down. Her sister, that she was incredibly close to, had this absolute freak accident happen. She got stung on the tongue by a bee, and unfortunately, it caused her throat to close, and so she passed away very unexpectedly. And this hit Sherilyn very hard. So her struggles with her mental health just worsened. And yet again, another tragic event. Bobby's mother, Starlet, and his dad, Bob Dean, had been married at this point for over 4 decades. Something unfortunately happened within their marriage and led to a very nasty divorce. You can imagine what happens to a family when the patriarch and matriarch of that family that has been together for decades at this point falls apart. It causes a ripple effect throughout the entire family, and unfortunately, that's exactly what happened in the Jamison family. There was a lot of tension between multiple family members. From the way I've seen it described, Bob Dean, which is Bobby's father, he was getting into a lot of issues with other family members in regards to this divorce, and this led to a lot of different members filing a protective order against him, including his own son, Bobby. In this protective order, Bobby claimed that his father had threatened to kill his family not once, but twice. One time in November of 2008, and I guess during this time, Bobby Dean attempted to run over Bobby with his car, and again in April of 2009. And Bobby stated in this protective order that his father was involved in multiple nefarious things, such as, quote, prostitution, drugs, and gangs, and that his father was a, quote, very dangerous man who thinks he is above the law. He really painted this picture that his father was just not a great person. He was very dangerous, that he was taking his father's threats very seriously, and even went on to state that his entire family felt scared for their lives. They literally were worried this man was going to show up and kill them. But unfortunately, for one reason or another, this protective order ended up being denied, so the Jamisons never achieved this feeling of safety from Bob Dean. Obviously, with all these different stressors that are going on, you've got family threats, you don't feel safe, you're struggling with money, you're struggling with mental health. Something had to kind of give here. So it seemed that Sherilyn wanted to attempt to file a suit against her ex-husband for child support back pay. From what I've seen through the different court records, he owed about 40 months of back pay. That is a lot of money. It totaled to like $30-something thousand. And given the fact they were both on fixed incomes and she seemed to be supporting her son most of the time, obviously she wanted to be able to have access to that money. And so she filed this lawsuit against her ex-husband. But it seems that somewhere along the way, tables turned and this went a completely different direction. Point in the middle of all of this legal battle, an emergency custody order was put in place about Sherilyn's son. From the minimal information that I have found online, again, I don't know why this exactly was called. It usually takes something pretty serious for this to be called, but it does seem that her son did speak out himself about wanting to live with his father. According to what I've seen online, her son was at an age, he was 12 at this point, where he had some sort of say in his custody, and he said that his mother had been acting odd lately, and so he would rather move in with his dad. So complete flip here. I am sure she was not expecting any of this, and this was a huge blow. She went in this expecting to hopefully get money to support her son and the rest of her family, and instead she ended up losing custody of him. So in July of 2009, her son moved out permanently to live with his father, and this just absolutely reaped chaos on the Jamison family even further. Obviously, when this happened, she no longer was able to get that back pay. They suspended that back pay. However, in an even more unexpected kind of turn of events, not only did they not give her this back pay that was owed to her, but they ultimately decided that Sherilyn would be the one to owe child support. So a little over a month later, after losing custody of her son, after again just being taken out by this huge blow, Sherilyn attempted to take her life. Now, she did end up being found. This was stopped, and she was taken to the hospital where she was for a while, and then she was ultimately released back to her family, hopefully in a more stable condition. But immediately after being released, there was another issue with her child, this time Madison. Madison had just started kindergarten at a local elementary school, and some sort of incident happened on the playground to where both of Madison's front teeth were knocked out. And so immediately Bobby and Sherilyn withdrew her from the school, said, forget this, we're homeschooling her. They had already been through a lot, and there were rumors that swirled around that they were going to sue the school. They were at their limit. This was it. Something had to change because it had just been years and years of absolute chaos. And so they kind of decided, you know what, it's not just going to be a few things that change. We're going to change absolutely everything about our life. So Bobby and Sherilyn made the decision to uproot their entire family, their entire life, and move to the middle of the mountains where they could essentially heal as a family. And it was being viewed as a fresh start, something that they both felt they desperately needed. So Bobby immediately began to look for different properties online, and he stumbled across a 40-acre property in the Sandboys Mountains. This is exactly what the family had been looking for. It was raw land, so essentially whatever they wanted to do with it would be at their fingertips. Now, since there was no house on the property, they decided that they were going to take their shipping container that they had at their property currently and move that to the property, the 40 acres, and live out of that temporarily until they could build their dream home. This just seemed absolutely perfect to them. They were known to kind of keep to themselves. They loved being outside. They loved spending time with just each other. They were homebodies. So being able to be out in the middle of nowhere in 40 acres is an absolute dream to them. But to give you more of an idea of just how isolated this area was, first of all, this was in Latimer County, where the population is like 9,000 for the entire county. This particular area in the Sandboys Mountains, Panola Mountain area, it's basically all dirt roads in the middle of nowhere. There are very few people that live out in this area because it is very difficult, first of all, to get to the area. There's no electricity that runs out to it. Most people rely on generators. Speaking off-grid kind of location. And this would be a completely different pace of life for them. But it seemed that they felt like this was the only option that they really had left. But this fresh start that was supposed to change their lives forever and end this just plague of chaos that had come upon their lives ended up mysteriously ending their lives instead. On October 16th, 2009, at about 3 p.m., Latimer County Sheriff's Department received a call from concerned hunters in the area of Panola Mountain, which is in Sandboys Mountain. Now, they claimed that there was a truck sitting on the side of this dirt road. It's a dead-end dirt road high up in the mountains, and they believed that it had been there for at least a few hours. And this particular area, I guess, it's just not common to see random cars kind of sitting about. However, the particular area it was in used to be like an old oil well. And so they initially thought, maybe this belongs to someone working in the area. But, just in case there's someone wandering around these mountains that are, by the way, very treacherous, they wanted to let authorities know. Initially, because it had just been a few hours, authorities were not overly concerned. There was no reason to be. It could, in fact, just be a worker. So they did not rush out to this location until a couple hours later when the hunters called back. And this time, the hunters are like, actually, this truck hasn't been here for just a few hours. People in the area are claiming that they have seen this truck here for days. And so at this point, authorities with Latimer County Sheriff's Department headed out to the area to try to figure out what was possibly going on. And immediately upon arriving to the vehicle, they knew that something was incredibly wrong. As they peered inside of the windows of this truck that was kind of like haphazardly parked over to the side of this dirt road, they saw a dog inside of the car. And this dog was barely clinging to life. In order to save the dog, they smashed the window and pulled it out and realized how emaciated this dog really was. It was clear that this dog only survived because it had been eating its own feces. So authorities began to wonder, okay, we went from this car being here for a couple of hours to now this car has been here a couple of days to now this car has potentially been here long enough to almost starve a dog to death. What is going on? Where are the owners of this car? Did someone just abandon this car and this dog? You can imagine all of the questions that they had running through their brain at this point. But man, oh man, are those questions just going to keep on adding on. Now, the first obvious fear was that someone may have gotten lost on this mountain. Someone came to check out hunting property or, wanted to come and take a walk through the mountains and figured this was a great place to do it. These mountains were not the kind of mountains that you did that at unless you knew them. This entire area was filled with ravines and cliffs and all sorts of really dangerous terrain. It's not an easy area to navigate. It's described as having a triple canopy. So basically it is impossible to move through the brush on its own. It's really difficult to see what's coming ahead of you. If someone had in fact managed to go out onto this mountain and get lost, there was a very large chance they were out there hurt somewhere or potentially deceased. So deputies immediately began to do an inventory of the truck to try to find some sort of identification, maybe see if there's any evidence at all that would suggest where this person or people went. And they managed to find that whoever owned the truck, whoever had been in this truck, had essentially left all of their important belongings behind. They found that this truck, thanks to the ID left behind, belonged to Bobby Jamison. And it was clear that his wife, Sherilyn, and his daughter, Madison, who was 6 years old at the time, was also with him. This changed very rapidly from one person possibly being lost on this mountain to an entire family, including a very young child. Bobby's cell phone and his wallet had been left in the car. Sherilyn's purse was left in the car. And despite the cold temperatures being towards the middle end of October, they had left all of their jackets in the car as well, and then obviously their dog. So it seemed as if they had intentions of coming right back, as if they maybe hopped out of the car real quick to look at something and then just didn't get back in. The car had been locked. None of this was making any sense. And so immediately, 5 to 6 deputies were sent out to search the immediate surrounding area to try to find any signs of the family. Now, unfortunately, there had been heavy rain in the past week, and a lot of information that may have helped them in this search was unfortunately washed away in all of that. So there ended up being no tracks to follow, nothing of that sort. And so ultimately nothing ended up being found. And so they decided to kind of regroup, figure out more information about the Jamisons, check through the cell phone that had been left behind, just anything at all that would give them some direction to go in and to hopefully get some sort of timeline. Because at this point, they're still not even sure when exactly this family could have gotten lost on this mountain. So through their digging, they found that the Jamisons had actually left their home on October the 7th to head to the mountains to check out this 40-acre property that they had intentions of moving to. But upon arriving to this area, they very quickly got turned around with all of the different dirt roads. Nothing has street signs in this area. And so despite this very low population, especially in this particular area, they thankfully managed to pass by someone who was able to kind of flag them down, and they were like, hey, we are lost. Obviously, Bobby had his phone on him and his GPS, but I'm sure on roads like that where people could have just kind of created roads along the way, that the directions were not as clear as he would have hoped. But this individual seemed to be incredibly helpful. They told authorities that the family seemed that day to be in great spirits. Everything about them seemed completely normal. They were excited about this idea of potentially moving out this way, and because this individual lived relatively close to this land they were looking at, they asked them a ton of questions like, is it easy to build? What are some issues we might run into? Just this whole lengthy list of questions, and eventually managed to get the exact GPS coordinates of the land they were supposed to be looking at, and they were off on their way. But it seems that for some reason, they decided to not actually go all the way to this property, and instead they turned around and went home, seemingly with plans to return the following day. So on the 8th of October, the Jamisons headed out yet again to this property. They packed up their truck, they headed out, and they actually had plans this day to meet with the realtor that was in charge of selling this particular property. Now, they went to this meeting, and there's not been a lot of talk about how exactly this meeting went, if they expressed intentions of purchasing the property, but after they met with the realtor, they then headed off, according to their GPS, to ultimately kind of near the location where their truck would be found, which means that the 8th is probably the day that they went missing, that this truck ended up abandoned on the side of this dead-end dirt road. So the GPS showed that where their car had parked, however, had not been the only place along that road they had been that day. So it seemed that they had at one point been higher up on the mountain. From there, the GPS shows that they took about a 15 to 20 minute walk along the plateau of the mountain before heading back to their car and starting the trip back down the mountain. And then everything stopped. The GPS was not used again, and for some reason their truck remained locked on the side of the road with all of their belongings in it, including their dog, and no one had any idea where they went. Now, this meant as well that no one had reported this family missing for over a week. But this seemed to be easily explained by just the Jamisons' lifestyle in general. So, according to friends and family, the Jamisons loved their privacy, which is probably why they wanted to move out to the absolute middle of nowhere. While they were close with their family, it was not uncommon at all for them to not call for a week or two, possibly even a month. It also was apparently common for them to head out of town without telling anyone that they were going anywhere. Sherilyn's best friend even said that sometimes they wouldn't talk for an entire year and then they would just start talking again like no time had passed at all. So their lack of calls or texts over this week-long period wasn't anything abnormal. And on top of that, I am still not sure if they even told anyone they were planning on going to look at property anywhere, since they did keep so much to themselves. On top of that, Madison had just been pulled from elementary school. And so unfortunately, there was no attendance or anything to draw attention to her absence either, so not a single person had even known this entire time to report them as missing. But that is a lot of time for them to potentially be out in the elements with no food, with no water, without their jackets. So this was a potentially very dangerous situation. So authorities decided at this point that they wanted to track that location further up the mountain to see maybe they went camping up there. Maybe there's some sort of evidence, because so far there was nothing around the truck. So they followed the GPS to this spot off the side of the road higher up the mountain, and they could say pretty certain that the family had been there because there were multiple shoe prints in the area that thankfully had not been totally washed out by the rain. One of those shoe prints very clearly was around the size of a 6-year-old child, so Madison. There, they were also able to find evidence that helped authorities kind of track where the family had gone on their walk. Photograph of Madison Jamison, and it is thought to be the very last photograph ever taken of her. So this photo was taken by a large rock a short distance off the road during this 15 to 20 minute walk that the family had taken. And there's a lot of speculation around this particular photo because friends and family have claimed that they questioned based off this photo if this was even the Jamisons that took it. If potentially someone else may have had Madison, someone else may have had Bobby's BlackBerry, because to them, this is not a typical picture of Madison. She appears uncomfortable, her arms are crossed over her chest in like a protective kind of position. She's not even looking at the camera, her smile seems fake. So there's a lot of people, including friends and family, that believe that something else may have been going on here, but there's also a handful of people that believe this is just a 6-year-old being a 6-year-old. And I will say from my own personal experience, as I have a 6-year-old, that looks like 90% of his pictures because he doesn't want his picture taken. So he's looking at whatever he wants to look at, forcing a smile so that I'll get the picture over with, and standing in one of the most awkward positions ever. So while this picture could definitely be something odd, it could also just be a 6-year-old totally not in the mood to be photographed. But there was nothing else along this walk, along this area, that gave authorities any sort of idea what could have possibly happened. And so a full-blown search was put together for the following day, with the theory still being that they got lost on the mountains. There was no other way to really explain this. Now, this search turned out to be one of the largest searches done in all of Oklahoma history, and there was absolutely no lack in media coverage either. So at the time that this family disappeared, it's literally around the exact same time that the McStay family disappeared. I covered them a while back. And so you can imagine how the entire country is reacting when they're hearing that not just one entire family disappeared, but now two entire families have disappeared. How on earth does an entire family disappear? So every single resource possible was brought out to try to locate this family, because all eyes were on Latimer County Sheriff's Department. There were over a dozen dog teams that were brought out, not just cadaver dogs, but they also brought out air scent dogs. They were able to use all of the belongings inside of the Jamisons' vehicle to kind of give that scent to the dogs. People were on foot. There were horses out there. There were mules. There were ATVs, helicopters, airplanes. This was going to be a very slow and tedious process, again, because of the kind of terrain. Now, obviously, you can cover an area like that very quickly from the sky. But because of the triple canopy, you really couldn't see anything from the sky. So that left searchers on foot and horseback, but they could also only go so fast because, first of all, they want to ensure they're doing a proper job in the search, but they're also dealing with this triple canopy. They're trying to walk through all of this greenery. They're trying to make sure they don't fall in a pit, fall off of a cliff. Ended up calling off the search after that Sunday because the terrain was so incredibly challenging, and they wanted to figure out a way to do a lot more focused search areas instead of just running off into the middle of the wild, covering a lot of space and hoping that they found something. But the community decided to come together and search in these areas themselves. People that were familiar with this terrain, familiar with this particular land, they went out and did everything they could to search the area because they could navigate it a lot easier than the search and rescue teams at this point. Pretty quickly, organized searches with the Sheriff's Department, OSBI, and FBI all began again. Now, while these hundreds of searchers were combing the entire area, taking on this challenging terrain, investigators continued to go through the truck and the Jamisons' belongings left behind to try to find some sort of answers within that. But like most things in this case, it ended up just leading to a lot more questions. Not only did Bobby's phone hold this last photograph of Madison, but someone or something had also called his voicemail from his phone on October the 12th, days after the family vanished from their truck. And if the family at this point was already known to be missing and the doors to the truck were found locked, how on earth were there not one but multiple calls to his voicemail? Now, many have speculated that their dog, Maisie, had potentially dialed the voicemail, maybe walked over the phone and it just so happened to call it, which, I mean, possibly. I do think that is something that could potentially happen. However, since the voicemail was called multiple times, I mean, what are the chances of that? I definitely feel like there's something a little strange with that. And on top of that, if this dog is repeatedly walking all over Bobby's phone, wouldn't you see like other random things put in, like 7654 pound has been called, like, something absolutely bizarre. So the fact that it was very specifically the voicemail repeatedly is definitely a little bit strange to me, but authorities really didn't know what to make of this, and it doesn't seem like there was a lot of focus put into it either. And then another discovery in the car possibly changed the course of the entire investigation. $32,000 in cash was found in a bank bag underneath the driver's seat of the car. How on earth did a couple that was reliant on disability paychecks manage to have that much cash on them? This definitely made authorities feel like something more was going on here, and they were just missing it. They didn't have all of the pieces connected together yet. So based on all of the evidence so far, the way that the car was found, from the money to the lack of evidence found in the surrounding areas, authorities had a new theory. Sheriff Israel Beecham, who was investigating this case, said, quote, "I think they were forced to stop and got out of the truck to meet someone they recognized, and I think they either left willingly or by force." There were multiple reasons why it was believed that this could be a possibility. First and foremost, as we've already spoken about, it didn't seem that the Jamisons left their car with intentions of leaving it for very long. They left all of their important belongings behind, and the idea that maybe they just went further down the mountain to take another walk and got lost seemed to not really match up, because on their previous walk they had taken, they had used their GPS. They had taken a phone with them. They clearly knew they did not know how to navigate this area, so why would they use all those resources at one point, drive like a few minutes down the road, and then decide to just totally leave that all behind this time? And on top of that, no one believed that Madison would have ever been okay leaving their family dog Maisie behind in the car. According to friends and family, Maisie, the family dog, was Madison's absolute best friend. She refused to go anywhere without this dog. And so the chances that Madison was okay leaving the car willingly and leaving Maisie behind, nobody was believing it. So all of this information strongly led authorities to feel that they were forced to leave the vehicle. And so they decided to take a closer look at the surrounding area that the truck was found, the truck itself, and see if there were any signs to support this idea. But ultimately, they didn't find anything. There was absolutely no sign at all that there was like forced entry into the car, that there was any sign of a struggle. It's not very likely that the Jamison family, any of them really, would have willingly walked off with someone without putting up some sort of fight if they felt they were being threatened. There was no disturbance of the ground to suggest there had been a scuffle, no disturbance inside of the car, and also the car had been locked. So if they had been like bombarded at their car and someone says, hey, you need to get out of here and follow me, first of all, they're probably not going to bring their keys. Second of all, they're probably not even going to close their car door. And they're definitely not going to bring their keys, close their door, lock it, and then go with this individual that's potentially threatening them. So a lot of this just seemed really, really off. And authorities were also suggesting that whoever drove up this one-way dirt road and blocked the Jamisons' path was potentially someone that they knew. And this also just didn't make any sense. The Jamisons, again, kept to themselves a lot. So I'm sure there were not many people that even knew they were up in this mountain area. And this was like an hour or so away from their home. So unless someone followed them all the way out there and then just hung out in the back and watched as they like explored the area for hours on their own and then went and decided to stop them, it just wasn't really making a lot of sense. But to top it off, the last person to ever see the Jamisons alive was saying that no one else went up the mountain that day. There was a man living about a quarter mile down that same dirt road that the Jamisons were found on. There are a few other dead-end roads leading off of it, but basically, if you want to get to the area that they were at, you are going up and down that one road. There's no other option. And this man said that he remembered seeing the Jamisons drive up the road that morning, but that nobody else went up or down the mountain, including the Jamisons. After they went up there, he never saw them again. Now, there are plenty of people who believe it's a huge possibility that he just missed someone else going up this road. However, as someone who has lived in a rural area before, especially if you were in a place that rural where it is not at all common for any cars to be driving in front of your house, because where on earth are they going to go to? You are on high alert about things like that. When it's not common to hear a car going down the road when you're not expecting it, your brain picks it up immediately. I feel like if someone had come up that mountain afterwards and blocked the family's path, like authorities were suggesting, this man very likely would have seen it, and he's saying he didn't. So this led authorities back to square one with plenty of questions. The FBI and OSBI were diligently working on this case along with NCMEC that joined in to try to hopefully provide other resources, seeing as there was a missing child as well, and that is what they specialize in. So they created all sorts of flyers, posters to be distributed all over, and they actually used that photograph of Madison, the last known photograph of her, on this poster in hopes that someone would potentially recognize her. Friends and family of the Jamisons also did everything that they could to ensure that everyone was very well aware that this entire family was missing. There were Facebook pages that were created. We're also holding vigils and fundraisers to try to raise a reward in hopes that someone would come forward with some sort of information, because this entire time, the family from the get-go strongly believed that the Jamisons had actually been murdered. They did not believe that the Jamisons would have simply walked into the woods and gotten gotten lost or succumbed to the elements. They felt like someone had harmed this entire family. So the searches continued, and the search dogs that were used ultimately led authorities to this plateau that the family had originally been on for their 15 to 20 minute walk. And the dogs really didn't want to leave this area, and ultimately they ended up hitting on a water tower nearby. And after multiple hits on this water tower, authorities feared that somehow, some way, the Jamison family may have ended up inside. So the entire tower was drained just in case, so they could search, make sure there was nothing inside. But ultimately, the water tower was empty. It led them to nothing, and authorities were unsure why the dogs repeatedly hit in this particular area. But just as that was ruled out, an even scarier theory made its way to the forefront. A discovery was made in the truck that forced authorities to look into the idea that this was potentially a murder-suicide. An 11-page letter was found tucked somewhere in the truck, and this letter was written by Sherilyn, clearly to Bobby. And it was a hate letter. The entire letter basically described how unhappy Sherilyn was, that she felt that Bobby didn't care about her and Madison, that he would be better off without a family. She called him a hermit and said he was a loner, and spoke in this letter about wanting a divorce. And in one quote in particular, there was something pretty scary. Sherilyn said, quote, "I would not wish my daughter to be raised in foster care because of you being in prison for attempted murder and her mother dead." Sherilyn seemed very angry and upset in this letter, and so authorities wondered if maybe she was at her limit. She found this as a perfect opportunity to lead her husband and daughter out to the woods and essentially kill her entire family. Now, one thing I do want to quickly point out, however, is that that quote is worded very strange if you look at it. It says, "I would not wish my daughter to be raised in foster care because of you being in prison for attempted murder and her mother dead." So I'm not exactly sure what kind of cryptic message is hidden in that, but if she's claiming she's dead and Bobby would be in jail for attempted murder, that clearly means that he didn't murder her, because that wouldn't make sense. So who is he trying to kill? What kind of situation would they have potentially been in that would put them in that sort of circumstance? But I digress. We'll dive deeper into that in a little while. According to Sherilyn's mother, Sherilyn owned a .22 caliber handgun, and this was something that Sherilyn always kept with her at all times, even when they were in the car. I think the car is typically where she would store the gun, and so if they had gone anywhere in this truck for any period of time, the gun was likely going to be in there. And authorities are hearing about this weapon for the very first time at this point, and to them it's just kind of supporting this theory that this was a potential murder-suicide. And so obviously their first task is, we need to locate this gun, because if we find it, it makes this less likely. If we don't, they could potentially be out there on the mountain somewhere, and this gun could be out there as potential evidence. So there were very heavy searches done within the Jamison vehicle as well as their home, and no gun was located. So I feel like this just kind of pushed this theory even further, along with the fact that they also found more writings by Sherilyn at the family home. Sherilyn kept a very detailed, emotion-packed journal, and within this journal, she had spoken numerous times about problems with Bobby. She said that he was toxic, that he had turned into a monster. There were multiple times where she had mentioned wanting a divorce from Bobby. So this kind of, again, fed into this idea that Sherilyn was not at all happy. Friends and family said that they had, in fact, been struggling with finances, that they had spoken about divorce to each other and to others a handful of times. But they all said that ultimately Bobby and Sherilyn, despite their struggles, they absolutely loved each other, and they always tried their absolute hardest to figure things out and keep their family together. And so no one believed at all that this idea of murder-suicide was possible. Sherilyn definitely had her moments of struggling, but nobody from either side of the family felt that she would actually harm Bobby, and neither of them would ever harm Madison. But authorities were not convinced, and they felt that if this was in fact the case, that the family couldn't possibly be far away from their vehicle. And so the searches really ramped up again, because according to the sheriff, while you can easily hide the bodies of someone else, for instance, Bobby and Madison, if Sherilyn then went on to end her own life, she can't hide herself after death. So if this was in fact what happened, it should have been relatively easy to locate the family, and this could make the search potentially a lot easier. But after endlessly searching 10 square miles, nothing at all was found, and so this theory was kind of sidelined. There really wasn't anything to support it other than this angry letter and the other few angry writings from Sherilyn's journal. And even then, you can't say for sure that just because someone writes something they feel in their journal that they would ever actually act upon that particular feeling or emotion, especially when it comes to Sherilyn. While the letter in the truck was definitely hostile, according to friends and family that knew her, this sounded like Sherilyn off her medication. And the best way that she knew how to cope was through her journal, was through writing it. And so this seemed to be just a therapeutic thing for her to do. And while it sounds very scary and what she's saying is very intimidating and angry, this could also just be a way for her to release these feelings and emotions. There was also no way to tell when exactly the letter found in the truck had been written. So while it could have been something they were reading on the way to the mountains and they were arguing about this, that, and the other, it's also just as likely that that letter was like months old. I have not seen anywhere that it was dated, and they had also found multiple like old prescription bottles from Bobby in the truck because of his chronic back pain. So if he's not throwing out things for long periods at a time in his car, it's very likely she had given this to him months ago and he just didn't ever do anything with it, that it had just been sitting there and they just so happened to find it and believe it was possibly involved in the family's disappearance. And on top of that, when they did actually find a dated journal entry, it was from 3 days prior to the family going missing, and Sherilyn is not speaking badly about Bobby at all. She says, quote, "Bobby Jamison, a genius, a man with special gifts, a loving and tender soul." So she's speaking about him in a very positive light. Granted, there are a lot of things that can happen over the course of 3 days, but there is just not enough solid information here to suggest that she was in any sort of mindset that would have led her to lash out and kill her entire family. There was just not enough to really prove anything, and I feel like it's very easy to speculate on someone's mental state given things that they have done in the past, but we truly just don't know. It seemed like every theory so far was slightly possible. It all seemed like it could have potentially happened, only to have just enough questionable information thrown into the mix to just keep authorities guessing. Sheriff Israel Bishop even said that most investigators would love to have the amount of evidence that they had in the Jamison case, but despite having all of that evidence, they weren't able to solidly go any sort of direction. Usually they would try to rule one out and then move to the next one and slowly work down the list until they have something solid, but they weren't able to rule anything out at all. Every single potential theory, every single potential lead was this loose end of possibility. And it was at this point that authorities really began to dive into the history of the Jamison family, especially the recent history, and they uncovered some very strange information. According to those that knew Bobby and Sherilyn, for one reason or another, leading up to their disappearance, both Bobby and Sherilyn started to believe that their house was haunted. Now, I don't know if this was something entirely new to the family. For Bobby, it seems it was, but I've seen it described that Sherilyn had always been kind of like a spiritual person, that she frequently said that she could speak to spirits and could cast out demons and all these other things. And it seemed that they were trying to find a way to fix whatever they believed was going on. So Bobby and Sherilyn started to attend a prayer meeting, started to speak to a pastor named Gary Brandon, and he was able to kind of jot down all of the different things that the Jamisons had told him in those weeks leading up to their disappearance. Bobby was incredibly concerned about these spirits that he felt were in their home. He told Pastor Gary Brandon that the last time he had seen these spirits was on October 2nd, so just days before the entire family vanished, and that he had seen 2 to 4 spirits walking on the family's roof of their home in the middle of the night. And he was very disturbed by this. He felt that these were bad spirits, they were potentially dangerous, and so in all of these different meetings with Pastor Gary Brandon, he would kind of describe deeper what was going on. He expressed that he had tried natural remedies, that he bought a satanic Bible and was trying to look into that to see if there was any way he could cast these spirits away from his home. And it got to the point where he even started to ask Pastor Gary Brandon if there were, quote, special bullets for spiritual warfare. And according to those that knew Bobby, specifically his mother, this was not like him. This was abnormal. He had never claimed to see spirits before or, experience anything of the sorts. So she wasn't quite sure what to make of this information. And while it's not been publicly stated if he struggled with any sort of mental health disorder, it seems that this was just kind of random out of nowhere, but Sherilyn was claiming the exact same things. Sherilyn was also telling Gary Brandon that there were spirits in the home, but her version of things was very, very different from Bobby's and didn't seem quite as paranoid. She agreed that there were about 2 to 4 spirits that were living in the family's home, but she didn't feel threatened by them at all. And she even said that she had dealt with spirits multiple times before in her life and that she and Madison could both speak to the dead, and so she felt there was no threat. She actually stated that she believed that these were angels coming to their family in the form of children, and there were even 2 names, the name of Michael and Emily, for 2 of, I guess, those 4 spirits that she said were in the home. And again, Sherilyn did not seem super stressed about this. She didn't believe they were going to cause her family any harm, and she actually said that Madison had befriended one of these little children spirits and would regularly talk to them. They also found that Sherilyn would refer to herself as a witch to all of her neighbors. She had sprawled graffiti all over the side of the shipping container that they were going to use if they moved to the 40 acres. Things about how God is like the only way, and then witches don't like when their cats are killed, because I guess one or a few of her cats had shown up deceased, and Sherilyn believed that they were being poisoned by neighbors. And so she wrote this message as like a warning to the neighbors to stop poisoning her cats because she was essentially a witch. She would invite neighbors inside for witch's brew, just things along those lines. So obviously, seeing this information, you do start to question what exactly their mental state was. And we've spoken about this time and time again, and this thought has popped into my head numerous times throughout researching this entire case. I believe you pronounce it folie à deux or folie, I don't know, it's French, but it basically means madness of 2. It's shared madness, where one person can be so worried about something or concerned about something that those around them start to also believe it's happening. And there are actually multiple different cases where families have acted very strangely or disappeared or run off due to something like this. And they can never explain afterwards why they believed what was happening and, why they went along with these crazy plans. But that's kind of how madness of 2 works. But according to Sherilyn's best friend, Nikki, this was something completely explainable. She was like, Sherilyn has always told me that if someone is bothering you, act as crazy as you possibly can and they will leave you alone. And so she strongly felt that Sherilyn was acting out, saying these things to the neighbors, claiming to be a witch because she was hoping this would lead her neighbors to leave her alone. But that doesn't really explain everything. If Sherilyn uses that as a method to get people who are bothering her to leave her alone, yeah, of course that can explain her behavior around their family home. But that wouldn't explain why the family would go and seek out a pastor, would willingly hand over this information, and it also wouldn't explain why Bobby was claiming kind of the exact same things from a more paranoid state of mind. And this focus on their odd behavior was just exacerbated when they found very odd security footage from the family's home. Now, apparently, there were 2 cameras outside of the Jamison family home pointing towards their driveway. And these cameras had actually been installed by starlet Bobby's mother after Bobby's dad, I guess, threatened the family. Everyone got protection orders against him because Starlet felt very unsafe in her home, so she got herself cameras. And she also wanted to be able to protect her son, her granddaughter, her daughter-in-law, so she put up cameras for them as well. And it actually captured the Jamison family packing up their car to leave the morning of the 8th. Now, I do want to state before I get into this that this is a huge topic of discussion in regards to this case, because there are many people that feel that the behavior was not at all odd in this video. However, I do want to state that no one other than authorities and a handful of other people have ever seen the entirety of this video. The only thing that's been released to the public is little segments of it in a few seconds, and so it's very difficult to really determine or make an opinion on it with such a small portion of it. But authorities, after watching the entire thing, deemed it as incredibly bizarre. So in this video, you can see both Bobby and Sherilyn making multiple trips to and from the car to pack it up. And this in itself was strange because it was something that they could have probably done in like 2 or 3 trips, but both Bobby and Sherilyn each made at least 20 trips back and forth from the car. And it took them an incredibly long time. And what they did during those trips was equally as strange. The entire time Bobby and Sherilyn are going back and forth, they do not communicate with each other a single time. It is as if they are the only ones to exist in that exact moment. Now, while going back and forth, a few times they are seen carrying the same items back and forth. They're seen putting things into the car, taking those same items back out, and then putting them back in. They come back and forth without anything a handful of times. There are also moments where both Bobby and Sherilyn just stop and stare off into the distance for a period of time. And it's also stated that there are even points where they change their clothing during making these trips. Their behavior seemed so odd that the sheriff's department decided to bring in a psychologist to look at it because they could not figure out what on earth was happening here. And ultimately, the psychologist said, "To me, this looks like Bobby and Sherilyn were on some sort of drug." Now, apparently the drug of choice in this area is meth. And so pairing that information, their strange behavior, the large amount of money that they had in their car, authorities believe that this could possibly be one of the answers as to what exactly happened here. Maybe Bobby and Sherilyn were involved in using drugs. Maybe that is what caused them to believe that there were spirits. Maybe it led them to this area out in the middle of nowhere. What could it possibly have led them to do next? Was this potentially a drug deal? There was just a lot of potentials going on after this information was shared by the psychologist. So immediately they wanted to try to find if there was any evidence whatsoever to support this theory, because the ongoing theme throughout this entire case so far was this theory seems plausible, but there's no concrete evidence to really support it fully or rule it out. And so the FBI actually went to the Jamison home and conducted a very thorough search. They also searched the entire vehicle again, and there were no drugs found absolutely anywhere. But it seemed like a lot of people, even still to this day, cling on to this idea that they believe drugs may be responsible for whatever happened to the Jamisons. But their family strongly pushes back against this. There were definitely a few things that could potentially suggest that drugs may have possibly been involved when it comes to Bobby and Sherilyn, but despite those things, their family did not believe this was at all possible. I guess just prior to their disappearance, both Bobby and Sherilyn had lost a lot of weight, which could absolutely be due to drug use. I guess there was also something strange that Bobby had said at one point the summer prior when they were struggling a lot with money. He said something about knowing a way to get them money, but he didn't want to involve Sherilyn in that. And while that could absolutely indicate some sort of drug involvement, again, there was absolutely no evidence to suggest this whatsoever. Sherilyn's mom had actually lived with them for a handful of months just prior to their disappearance. And she said if they had been using any sort of drug, especially if it were meth, that she would have known about it. That's not necessarily a drug that you can hide taking. She never saw any indication the entire time she was there that they were on any drug at all. On top of that, Sherilyn's best friend, Nikki, had her own history of meth use, and she said that being so familiar with it, she would have known right away if this was something that Sherilyn was potentially involved in or using. But there had never been any moment of concern where she thought that this was a possibility. But there are still so many people that believe that drugs were involved. But if that were the case, I strongly feel like something would have been found at the house. When you have all of these prescription bottles and things just kind of tossed around in Bobby's car, clearly they're not like constantly cleaning everything out. Why did they not find some sort of paraphernalia anywhere? You can't tell me there wouldn't be like an empty baggie or like something. So despite this security footage seemingly bringing an answer that the family was just on drugs, they obviously weren't. So what on earth caused them to behave the way that they did, which again, it's me. I personally think madness of two, but there's also multiple other reasons. I know that so many people believe it's strange that they would not talk to each other the entire time they're walking back and forth. But with the history of tension in the relationship, what if they just got into an argument before they left? What if Sherilyn was having second thoughts about moving out to the mountains, or Bobby was having second thoughts about moving out to the mountains, and it caused some sort of argument and they just didn't want to talk to each other during that time? I feel like maybe that part of the video could be explained away to that, but what about the other behavior? Why would they change their clothes? Why would they stare off into the distance? So much. There is just so much that couldn't be explained. However, there was one thing that did kind of come out of this video. We're able to take all of this video footage and create inventory of what should be in the truck. And they were able to find that there was one thing missing. Sherilyn had loaded up a brown leather briefcase into the car. Obviously, we don't know what the contents are, but when authorities searched this entire car, that one thing was missing. Why? Now, a lot of people believe, including the sheriff at the time, Israel Bishop, that there was money within that briefcase. There are people that believe that drugs were put into that briefcase, but regardless, it went somewhere and nobody knows where it is. So now that is the second thing known to belong to the Jamison family that is gone. A briefcase filled with who knows what, and a .22 caliber gun. So definitely a little bit suspicious. Authorities are dumbfounded and they have no idea what to think at this point about what happened, and they're back to square one. But now things are even more confusing than they had been before. And then they end up face to face with their first lead that really felt like it could potentially be it. It could potentially explain what happened to this family. Bobby and Sherilyn had actually allowed a man to come and rent a portion of their home. And I don't think this was a close friend of theirs. I believe it was just an acquaintance. I don't think it was an absolute stranger, is what I'm trying to get at. This man was supposed to move into the home to ease the burden that Bobby was feeling when it came to getting things done around the home, like handyman work, just upkeep of the house, because his chronic back pain did not allow him to do essentially any of it. And so they thought this was going to be something that would help them. They wouldn't feel as behind on everything. That's one of like the worst feelings in the entire world, but it ended up being an absolute nightmare. So this man either moved in or moved out, or potentially both, in July of 2009, just months prior to the family disappearing. And I guess shortly after he moved in, it became very clear that this was not going to work out, because as soon as Bobby would leave the home, leaving Sherilyn and Madison behind, this man would say some very strange, inappropriate, terrible things to Sherilyn and Madison, and made them both very uncomfortable. And this all came to a head on the last day that the man was there, because he essentially was kicked out at gunpoint. So Bobby had just left. Sherilyn and Madison were home alone, sitting on the couch trying to enjoy their day, when this man walks up, looks at Sherilyn, and says something along the lines of, "I'm a white supremacist, and you sure do talk a lot about having Indian blood, and I believe that anyone who is not just white should die." So he essentially threatened to kill Sherilyn, and right away she ran to get her .22 caliber, the gun that is missing, and pointed the barrel right at this man, like up against his head, and said, "You get out of my house right now. Like, you will not threaten me. You will not threaten my child. You need to leave." And I guess this man would not immediately leave the premises. So she ultimately fired 2 warning shots down at the ground and scared this man off of the property. This was devastating because not only had the family been terrified of, potentially being killed by Bobby's dad, like someone that's family, but now there's a man that had been living under their roof that seemed to want to kill at least Sherilyn, if not the entire family as well. And so authorities are hearing this and they're like, this man could have so many motives as to why he might potentially be involved in this family's disappearance. So immediately they want to locate this man. But the problem was that they didn't actually have his name. Now, thankfully, one of his prescription bottles had been left behind either in the house or Bobby's truck. So they were able to take this name, match it to this guy, confirm this is him, and the FBI set out on a manhunt to locate him. And when they finally did, I believe he was still in the area in a different city. U.S. Marshals found him, apprehended him, and he was brought in for questioning. But all of this hope that they had, that this could potentially lead them to answers, was snuffed out almost immediately, because while this man definitely had problems with the Jamison family, he had definitely threatened Sherilyn, he was actually incarcerated at the time that the family went missing. So he could not have possibly, at least personally, been involved in whatever happened to them. And while this lead didn't seem to work out, it kind of got the wheels in motion in terms of who else would potentially want to hurt the Jamisons. And this led them to Bobby's dad, 67-year-old Bob Dean Jamison. Now, as I had stated in the beginning of the video, they were having a lot of problems with Bobby's dad. He had, in the 2 years leading up to their disappearance, threatened to kill the entire family 2 times. And this protection order and all these things, this chaos happening with him, all occurred within 6 months of the family going missing. So authorities believed it was possible that he could have acted out on these threats. He would have had lots of motive. He obviously was already having issues with Bobby, which is why he threatened him multiple times. But he also probably was very angry that Bobby filed a protection order against him. And not just that, Bobby had also recently sued him. So apparently Bobby would occasionally work for his father at one of his father's convenience stores. And they had some verbal agreement that Bobby wouldn't get like a paycheck or anything for his hours worked, that essentially he would just eventually be paid for half of his sales. And there was also some other agreement that he would get like a certain piece of property and like some cars or something for Madison. There was just a big agreement. There were all these things that were supposed to trade hands here. And I guess when the divorce happened, we've got all this anger and tension and, legal battles. Bob Dean Jamison pulled all of that out from underneath Bobby, and he was mad. And so he filed a suit against his father. I had a very difficult time kind of like deciphering the legal mumbo jumbo in terms of this particular suit. But it doesn't appear that he gained anything from this. There are some resources that say he got some sort of money from this that could have potentially explained the $32,000 in cash found in their car. Other sources claim that that money was from a settlement from his car accident, but I've looked at all of these different court papers for all of this, and everything says dismissed and does not mention a settlement anywhere. So I don't know if there was like a settlement that happened outside of court, what exactly happened. Regardless, that could be a pretty large motive for Bob Dean Jamison. But this theory was kind of sidelined and shut down just as quickly as all of the other ones. It turned out that just prior to the Jamisons' disappearance, Bobby's dad fell very ill. And during this time, he was in and out of hospitals and different homes and things like that to deal with whatever illness or condition he was going through. And so, according to Bobby's uncle, there was no way that he could have physically been able to do anything to harm the Jamison family. Another reason this didn't make sense is that Bob Dean Jamison had actually taken everyone else off his will and listed Madison as the sole beneficiary. So she would have received everything. He wanted to pass down everything of his to her when he was gone, give her his entire legacy. And so why would he have done that if he then was also planning on turning around and killing the entire family, including his granddaughter? Sheriff Beecham said, quote, "Throughout this whole process, I found myself going back and forth as to what might have happened. I'm at my wit's end. I've asked for all the help I could get: 12 FBI agents, 3 OSBI agents, Troop Z, private investigators who have contacted me. I've belittled myself to the point where I listened to psychics. This case had absolutely baffled everyone, including all of the investigators that had worked on it. And unfortunately, Sheriff Beecham ended up, I believe, retiring and going to do something else. This case ended up being passed along to multiple different investigators, and despite families' efforts to keep it in the public eye and the oddness of the case, it did seem that things slowly began to die down. There were no more searches, no more people to rule out. There was nothing else to look into. They had already looked at what felt like every possible theory, and nothing had panned out. 4 years later, on November 16th, 2013, a very unexpected discovery was found, and this brought the now cold case back to the center of everyone's attention. Just under 3 miles away from where the Jamisons' truck had been found 4 years prior, hunters stumbled across partial remains. It appeared to be 3 partial sets of remains, all of which were face down, kind of lined up in a row. Obviously, a call was immediately put into police, and OSBI and Haskell County Sheriff's Department immediately showed out to this particular location. Obviously, everyone had a feeling that this could potentially be the Jamison family. What are the odds that this close to where they were last seen, there would be another group of 3 individuals that just so happened to all die together around the same time? The FBI, OSBI, and Haskell County Sheriff's Department did immediately do a search of the surrounding area. They wanted to see if there was any sort of identification or any sort of evidence that gave them answers, a potential weapon, but they weren't able to find any of that. The remains themselves had clearly been exposed to the elements for quite some time. It was obvious they had not been buried. These remains were just kind of laying on top of the earth, so they were very badly decomposed. It was essentially just bone left, and a lot of that bone was damaged. So an announcement was made that they were sending these remains off to a lab to try to get proper identification, but given the state of the remains, they weren't sure how long exactly that would take, and it ended up taking 8 full months. On July 3rd, 2014, these remains were positively identified as belonging to Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison. Due to decomposition, Dr. Lanter, who performed the autopsy, stated that there was no way they could figure out cause and manner of death. First of all, it was only partial remains. I believe they had the skulls of all 3 individuals, a couple of other bones, a few teeth, but it seems majority of the remains were no longer there. On top of that, there was also, quote, carnivore or rodent damage on all of the bones. And so that also kind of prevented them from being able to see what potentially happened. So despite finding the Jamisons family remains, there were still no answers. So a lot of people began to look deeply into the way in which they were found and tried to make sense of it. But like everything else, there really wasn't a lot that came out of that. The only belongings recovered around the Jamison family were a handful of shoes, a few fragments of clothing that were left behind, and interestingly, there was a, quote, fragment of a flexible material with a cloth material on one side that was found with Bobby Jamison, and interestingly, there was a dried flower with Madison. Now, this very easily could have been something that she had just been holding on to, but there are a handful of people out there theorizing that this could have potentially been left by an attacker. If this was, in fact, a homicide, what if this person who committed this crime had some sort of remorse? What if there was a personal connection? A lot of people ask the question as well that if they were this close to where their truck was found, how on earth were they themselves not located when these massive ongoing searches were occurring? And I definitely do understand the frustration when it comes to that. However, I have learned the very hard way through looking into multiple cases that there is really no way to 100% guarantee you have thoroughly searched a location. It's just very difficult. However, according to the hunter that located the Jamisons' remains, they were right off of a very obvious clear trail. Like, they were not deep into the woods. They were not off a ravine. They were not hanging on the edge of a cliff. They were on top of the surface, on top of the ground, face down, right off of a clear trail. And had there been searches in this area, the hunter did not understand how on earth their remains could not have been found. But that was not the only question that a lot of people had. Hunter stated that when he found these remains, there was a very clear hole in one of these skulls, which was later determined to be Bobby's skull. And with this theory that had been looked into by authorities that this could potentially be a murder-suicide, people were on the edge of their seats waiting to see, did you find Sherilyn's gun? Like, was this weapon found around here? But ultimately, no weapon was ever found in the area, so that kind of rules out this idea that it was in fact a murder-suicide, but that still left a potential. If there's a bullet hole in Bobby's head, it means that this is a homicide. But the OSBI made a statement saying they didn't believe foul play was involved, and when a lot of people started to question this, authorities came back and made a statement saying that this was not in fact foul play. They did not believe foul play was involved whatsoever, and that this hole that was seen in Bobby's skull was not a bullet wound. It was more likely from an animal. But the hunter that found their remains again spoke out and said, I've hunted forever. I know what a bullet wound looks like. I know what it looks like when an animal's chewing on bones, and a coyote or some animal absolutely did not make that mark. At this point, the case seemed to again go cold. It doesn't seem that they really started actively investigating any longer. It just seems like they said, nope, this is not foul play, but we're not exactly sure what it is. And there's no evidence to go off of, so the investigation seemingly stopped. So many people, especially the Jamison's family, still have questions because despite the fact that remains have now been found, this case is still technically open and it still remains unsolved. According to Sherilyn's mother, she has stated in the past that she actually believes this all could be chalked up to some religious cult. That maybe this satanic Bible, maybe these prayer sessions and these spirits, maybe Bobby and Sherilyn got involved in something that put them in a position that led to their murders. She strongly believes that this cult has a hit list of sorts and that Sherilyn ended up on it. And this kind of goes hand in hand with something that Sherilyn's best friend Nikki brought forward immediately after the Disappeared documentary aired on the Jamisons. Sherilyn's friend Nikki ended up getting a phone call after this airing, and it was from an anonymous woman. This woman said that she belonged to a white supremacist group, and that this group kept a book that was filled with a list of names. She said that this list of names was basically a collection of people that this particular group had a lot of issues with. Now, this woman claimed that when they would look through this book, when the group would go through it and, go through the names, that she would try to memorize as many names as possible. And then she would go home and look up these people to try to figure out what was happening with this list, what this group was doing. And 9 times out of 10, the people she looked up, it led her straight to a missing person. And so she started to believe that this group she was a part of was offing people left and right, and she claimed that one of those names on this list was Sherilyn. And she said after memorizing her name, she went home, looked it up, and saw that not just Sherilyn, but the entire family had gone missing. She believed that it had something to do with this group she was a part of. Now, from the way it's described, I believe Nikki didn't think too much about it initially. This could potentially just be someone calling in and wanting to be a part of something. Unfortunately, that happens a lot more often than you'd think. But after taking a second and really marinating with all of the information that this anonymous woman had given her, she knew too much. She knew way too much information about the Jamisons for this to be some random coincidence. Bobby's mother told True Crime Daily in another interview what her beliefs were. She claimed she believed that this was in fact a murder as well. She believes, at least as of when this interview was taken, that they saw something they weren't supposed to see, and this led to their death. And when it comes to those two theories, cults are definitely a thing, and they can be incredibly dangerous, especially if led by the wrong person. Let's think Charles Manson here. And so there is a huge potential this could be something that was going on. And we know that the Jamisons were desperately looking for some sort of solution, at least Bobby was, to these spirits that he was seeing all all over the home. When it comes to cults, they will use what you need against you. They say and do whatever they can to lure you in, trap you, and things go downhill from there. So while that definitely does sound like a crazy theory, I can see how that could potentially be possible. Maybe they got involved in this and realized it was not what they thought it was, and out of fear, they wanted to flee. They wanted to move out to the middle of nowhere. They wanted to get away from this cult. The cult potentially believed they knew too much, which kind of goes hand in hand with what Bobby's mother has said she believes, that they saw something they weren't supposed to, knew something they weren't supposed to, and something happened to them. When you really sit down and look at this idea that some third party potentially came in and murdered the entire Jamison family, there's just a lot of stuff that does not make sense or add up. First and foremost, for someone to even know they were going out that way, they would have had to have been being watched or stalked or something of the sort. They did not share with a lot of people what their plan was. Even Sherilyn's son had spoken to her just prior to their disappearance, and he said he had no clue they were planning on moving to the mountains. So the chances that they told someone, especially someone they potentially didn't trust and would have problems with them, that they were going out to the middle of a secluded area is slim to none. And so again, maybe someone was watching them, but if that were the case, why wouldn't that person have acted the day before? And on top of that, if you are going to follow someone or stalk them, you probably aren't going to follow them down a dirt road without immediately acting upon that situation, because you're going to be found out. So that just doesn't make any sense to me. And on top of that, this one individual said that no one else came up or down the mountain. Now, unfortunately, because multiple other people had driven their cars or dirt bikes or what have you up and down this road, I don't know if authorities were able to figure out if there were any other tracks. There had also been rain. So unfortunately, if there had been any evidence that someone was following them or stopped them in their path, that was all gone at this point. And then things get even more complicated when it comes to where the remains were ultimately found. Again, we have this third party that potentially wants to harm them. Why would that person get them out of the car and then walk them 3 miles into incredibly difficult terrain? It's usually about 30 minutes per mile at an average walking pace. So that already means it would have taken about 1.5 hours to get to this particular location on foot that the Jamisons were found. So now add to that time the fact that they're having to navigate this very treacherous landscape, and it probably would have taken twice that, maybe even more. I don't see someone taking the time to walk them that far into the woods to then kill them and then walk all the way back and leave. A lot of people believe that this money potentially was a motivator for someone, or that someone wanted to steal this from them or had some issue. But if that were the case, why wasn't the money taken? Why wasn't the car broken into? And on the subject of the $32,000, this is obviously another huge point of discussion in terms of this case. Now, there's multiple resources out there that state that no one knows where this money came from, including the sheriff himself. He has said that in multiple interviews that they don't know where the Jamisons got the $32,000. However, in one interview, Bobby's mother stated that he got it from a settlement back in 2005 from his car accident. And it was actually $64,000 that he split with Sherilyn, which equals $32,000. And so that could potentially explain where this money comes from. But then there's other resources claiming to be in contact with the family that are saying that the family's confirming it came from a settlement with Bobby's dad. So honestly, I have no way to confirm where this money came from, if it's normal for them to have it. If it's not, people are claiming that it is, but I have yet to see any solid documented proof to confirm what way. But regardless, even if they did have it, I don't necessarily think it would be strange for them to bring $32,000 along to look at a plot of land they hope to buy. Maybe they brought that thinking they're going to get the ball rolling. They're using that money to go towards purchasing it. Maybe that's the down payment. So I don't really understand why people see that money and they immediately think, oh, drug money. But if that is the case, to me, that kind of shows intention of the future. And while you can't always rely on that, it comes to someone's mindset on ending their own life or ending someone else's, I do think it is kind of important to at least remember that. It definitely does throw a wrench into the idea that this was a murder-suicide, along with the fact that if that were what happened, where is the weapon from that? Just like whoever initiates that and ends their life afterwards can't bury their own body or hide their own body, they also can't hide a weapon. Now, a lot of people have explained this away to, oh, there's lots of floods in the area and maybe could have washed the weapon away. However, if it failed to wash away a tennis shoe, I don't think the rain's going to pick up a 22 and carry that so far away that no one ever finds it and further searches. I'm also curious if there was anyone hunting in the area at this time, and maybe this could have been some accident and someone does not want to own up to it. It was bow season, I believe, when their deaths likely occurred. Granted, that would definitely leave behind some sort of evidence, but if someone was out there and decided to use a gun despite the fact that it was not the season for that, it's going to make it less likely that they're going to come forward and admit that there was an accident that happened. And I'm a lot more likely to believe that someone shot them on accident and the bullets floated away in these floods than an entire gun floating away from an alleged murder-suicide. At the same time, it's also possible that they simply died from being lost and due to exposure, which is the very first theory that anyone believed. But that still leads me to wonder how on earth they even got that far out in the mountains to begin with and why. With Bobby's back injury, I was kind of shocked they took a 15 to 20 minute walk to begin with further up on the mountain, and I just feel like after that and sitting back down in the car, I don't know how likely it is that he would have willingly gotten out and taken another one, let alone one that landed them so deep into the woods. Or maybe did they just want to go in real quick, use the bathroom, just something really easy out into the edge of the woods, and somehow got turned around and walked in the wrong direction and it led them to this specific location. But while all of what I just said is possible, does all of it explain the strange behavior? The surveillance footage? Are we looking too deep into the surveillance footage? It's very possible that all of these strange things occurring at the same time, like the house being haunted and believing that they're speaking to spirits, could be something entirely unrelated to their death altogether. At the end of the day, this is an entire family, including a 6-year-old little girl with her entire life ahead of her. And I don't know if there will ever be any answers, but I really hope that there is. I'm not sure how much further investigation can be done. I'm not sure what other answers they may be able to get to, because I feel like they've exhausted all options and this may just forever remain a mystery. But for the sake of the Jamisons' families, I really hope that it does not stay that way. I'm just at least thankful that the remains were found, period, and they were able to hold a funeral service in July of 2014, shortly after their remains were found. So despite all of these looming questions that are out there, the Jamison family at least has the ability to visit them in a place of peace, know that they are no longer just sitting on the side of the mountain. That's all that I have for you guys today. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Hallan fam so that we can hopefully bring them home together or bring them justice together, and I will see you guys in my next video.